By late fall of 1774, a decision made in Philadelphia had begun to reach into the shops and wharves of ordinary colonial life. In county after county, in cities and small towns alike, committees formed to watch the conduct of their neighbors. They inspected merchant records. They examined custom house entries. And when they judged that a man had broken the agreement, they published his name so that everyone would know. The instrument behind this vigilance was the Continental Association. A merchant found in violation could see his goods stored or shipped back, his name printed in the local gazette, his customers instructed to have nothing further to do with him. No royal governor had commissioned these committees, and Congress possessed no statutory machinery of its own to enforce their decisions. Yet in town after town they inspected, judged, and punished, and people obeyed. 7 weeks earlier, the men who built this system held no authority of any kind. 12 colonies had arrived in Philadelphia as separate political communities, many of their delegates strangers to one another, and none of them possessing authority over the others. They came to protest. They left having built machinery of government that no imperial authority had authorized. To understand how a boycott became a form of government, we have to return to the room where none of it was certain. On September 5, 1774, delegates from 12 colonies opened the First Continental Congress in Carpenter's Hall, a building owned by the city's Carpenters Guild. Georgia sent no one. The delegates chose Peyton Randolph of Virginia to preside, and then ran directly into the problem that could have ended the Congress in its first week. Before they could confront Parliament, they had to agree on how to count themselves. Delegates from the populous colonies argued that a colony's voice should reflect its people and its wealth. Patrick Henry pressed the point, insisting that the old distinctions among the colonies were dissolving. But one practical obstacle stood in the way. The Congress had no reliable figures for the population or property of any colony, which made it impossible to devise a fair proportional formula. So each colony received a single vote, whatever its size and whatever the number of men it had sent. The official record stated the reason plainly. Congress had no means of determining the importance of each colony, and the arrangement was not to be drawn into precedent for the future. The delegates also bound themselves to secrecy and kept the doors closed, so that controversial positions could be tested without immediate public consequences. These were men improvising a body that had no legal existence. That improvisation exposed the deeper problem. A Congress that could not weigh its own members certainly could not command obedience from a merchant in Boston or a planter on the James River. Its resolutions would carry exactly as much force as 12 separate colonies chose to give them. Everything the delegates did over the following weeks would run into the same wall. They could agree. They could not compel. The colonies they represented did not want the same things. Massachusetts needed help immediately, with its port closed and its charter government replaced. New York and Philadelphia merchants had cargoes at sea and credit tied to British houses. Virginia planters owed large debts to those same houses and depended on a single buyer for their tobacco. And every delegate knew that the usual answer had already been tried. Petitions had gone to London after the Stamp Act and after the Townshend duties, and each time the crisis had returned in a more dangerous form. While the delegates debated procedure, Massachusetts was slipping out of British control. General Gage held Boston with regular troops and had begun fortifying the neck of land that connected the town to the mainland. At the start of September, he sent soldiers to remove gunpowder from a magazine outside Cambridge, and a false rumor of bloodshed brought thousands of armed militiamen onto the roads within a day. They turned back when the report proved wrong. Everyone in Philadelphia understood what the alarm had revealed. On September 16th, a rider from Boston reached Philadelphia. Paul Revere carried resolutions drafted largely by physician Joseph Warren and adopted a week earlier by the towns of Suffolk County, Massachusetts. They went far past protest. They declared the coercive acts unconstitutional and void, urged Massachusetts to withhold obedience from the altered provincial government, told collectors to keep public money out of the hands of Crown officials, and called on the people to arm and drill their own militia. This presented Congress with an immediate dilemma. Endorsing the resolves meant approving armed preparation and the deliberate obstruction of royal authority in one colony on behalf of all 12. Refusing meant telling Massachusetts publicly that it stood alone. On September 17th, the delegates endorsed the resolves unanimously. The vote cost the moderates a great deal. Men from the middle colonies who had travelled to Philadelphia seeking reconciliation had now aligned themselves with a program of resistance they would never have proposed. They accepted it partly out of sympathy for Boston and partly because a divided Congress was worth nothing at all. From that afternoon, the punishment of one colony was the business of 12. But sympathy was not a policy. The delegates had agreed on whom to defend. They had not yet agreed on what they were defending. Congress now had to produce a constitutional position broad enough for 12 colonies to accept and firm enough to justify resistance. The two demands pulled against each other, and one delegate offered a way to reconcile them. In late September, Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania proposed a plan of union, an American legislature sharing authority with Parliament, keeping the colonies inside the empire and inside the law. It was seriously debated, and it was defeated by a margin of one colony. Later, the delegates struck it from their records altogether. With that door closed, the delegates set out their claims on October 14th in the Declaration and Resolves. The colonies asserted control over taxation and internal government, while still accepting a limited parliamentary role in the commerce of the empire. It was a careful position, and it gave 12 colonies one line they could defend together. But a declaration could describe their rights. It could not make Britain retreat. The delegates knew what happened to paper. Colonial merchants had signed non-importation agreements before, after the Stamp Act, and again under the Townshend duties, and those agreements had come apart quietly, as traders decided that principle was no longer worth the economic cost. A boycott announced was not a boycott kept. That left two real options. Congress could recommend another voluntary boycott and preserve the appearance that it was merely offering advice to free subjects. That approach was safe, familiar, and likely to fail in the same way. Or it could build machinery to compel compliance, which meant creating authority outside the imperial government and inside every county in America. The second was the stronger weapon. It was also a claim no colonial body had ever dared to make. On October 20th, the Congress adopted the Continental Association. After December 1st, no goods from Britain or Ireland were to enter the colonies. Beginning March 1st, 1775, colonists were not to buy or use them. Non-exportation was held back until September 10th, 1775, giving the tobacco and rice planters one more season to sell crops already in the ground. That delay was not generosity. It was the price of Southern agreement. The association also committed its signers to discontinue participation in the slave trade after December 1st, and it asked Americans to practice frugality and expand domestic manufacturing, because a boycott the colonies could not survive would not last a winter. Then came the 11th Article and the line the Congress crossed. In every county, city, and town, men qualified to vote for their colonial legislatures were to elect a committee. Its business was to monitor compliance with the association, inspect custom house entries and merchants' books, and publish the name of any violator in the local gazette, so that such foes to the rights of British America might be publicly known. A community that failed to comply would itself be cut off. The decisive quality of the design was its decentralization. Authority did not sit in Philadelphia, where a governor might reach it. It sat in a network of elected local committees spread across the colonies, bodies that royal officials could not easily dissolve or replace through ordinary legal means. A Congress with no legal power had handed enforcement to the one place the empire could not follow, into the neighbourhood. The rest of the business went quickly. On October 21st, the delegates approved an address to the people of Great Britain and a petition to the king, both careful to blame ministers rather than the monarch. On October 26th, the Congress adjourned, recommending that a second Congress assemble in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775, unless the dispute was settled before then. Whether any of it would work now depended on people the delegates would never meet. For a merchant, the change arrived on a fixed date. Goods arriving after December 1st could, at the owner's choice, be reshipped or delivered to the local committee for storage. A trader who tried to conceal or sell prohibited goods risked having his name published and his neighbours instructed to take their business elsewhere. In a small port, that was economic ruin, delivered without a court, a judge, or a statute. The scale of the change became visible within months. British exports to America fell from roughly £3 million in 1774 to about 220,000 the following year. The association reached households as well. Colonists were asked to give up British goods, and also the ordinary amusements that went with prosperity: horse racing, gaming, cockfighting, plays, and shows. Mourning was cut back to a black ribbon or a piece of crepe, with none of the expensive funeral display that custom expected of a respectable family. Buying became visible, and therefore political. A woman deciding what to put on her table was making a public statement about where her household stood. And in county after county, men stood for election to the committees. Thousands served: farmers, shopkeepers, and local office holders who had never held an imperial position in their lives. They examined books, judged disputes over prices, and pressed reluctant neighbours to sign. Where royal courts had closed and royal governors had lost their grip on the countryside, these committees were the working government. Customs officers still held their commissions. They no longer decided what came ashore. Above the committees, a second layer appeared. Provincial conventions and congresses met without royal summons, chose delegates for the next continental meeting, and took up business that legal assemblies could no longer perform. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress redirected tax payments away from the royal treasurer and began preparing military stores. A governor could still prorogue an assembly. He could not prorogue a convention that had never asked his permission to sit. The pressure crossed the ocean as well. Merchants in London, Bristol, and Glasgow, watching their American orders vanish, petitioned Parliament for redress and warned of ruin in their own towns. That was exactly the leverage the delegates had intended. Pressure applied from 3,000 miles away by ordinary people refusing to buy cloth and tea. In London, the answer was not negotiation, but denial. Ministers refused to acknowledge a body that had assembled without royal sanction, and the petition to the king received no favourable hearing. What the delegates called a defence of English liberty, the government read as a direct challenge to the supremacy of Parliament. Early in 1775, Parliament declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion and moved to restrict New England's trade and fisheries. So the year closed with two authorities operating in the same territory, each denying that the other existed. One held no legal power and was obeyed. The other held every legal power and could no longer enforce its authority. The delegates had set a date, May 10th, and a condition. The next decisive British response would not arrive as a document addressed to Congress. It would arrive as orders to a general in Boston,